Chapter 9. A Shoemaker, a Soldier, and a King. By the time Piero was 8 years old, the Führer had grown closer to him and was showing an interest in what the boy was reading, allowing him full access to his library and recommending authors and books that impressed him. He presented Piero with a biography of an 18th century Prussian king, Frederick the Great, written by Thomas Carlyle, a volume so enormous and with such small typeface that Piero doubted whether he would even be able to get past the first chapter. "A great warrior," explained Hitler, tapping the book's jacket with his index finger, "a global visionary, and a patron of the arts. The perfect journey. As we fight to achieve our goals, we purify the world and then we make it beautiful again." Piero even read the Führer's own book, Mein Kampf, which was a little easier for him to comprehend than the Carlyle, but still confusing. He was particularly interested in sections relating to the Great War, for that, of course, was where his father, Wilhelm, had suffered so much. Walking Blondie one afternoon in the forest surrounding the mountain retreat, he asked the Führer about his own time as a soldier. "At first, I was a dispatch runner on the Western Front," he told him, "passing messages between the armies stationed at the French and Belgian borders. But then I fought in the trenches at Ypres, and then Somme, and Passchendaele. Toward the end of the war, I was almost blinded in a mustard gas attack. Afterwards, I sometimes thought that it would have been better to go blind than witness the indignities that the German people were made to suffer after their capitulation." My father fought in the Somme," said Piero. "My mother always said that although he didn't die in the war, it was the war that killed him." The Führer brushed this comment away with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Your mother sounds like an ignorant person," he said. "Everyone should be proud to die for the greater glory of the fatherland. Your father's memory, Peter, is one that you should honor." "But when he came home," said Piero, "he was very ill, and he did some terrible things." "Such as?" Piero didn't like to remember what his father had done, and when he began recounting some of the worst moments, he spoke quietly and looked down at the ground. The Führer listened without changing his expression, and when the boy finished, he simply shook his head, as if none of that mattered. "We will reclaim what's ours," he said, "our land, our dignity, and our destiny. The struggle of the German people and our ultimate victory is the story that would define our generation." Piero nodded. He had stopped thinking of himself as French, and, becoming taller at last, and having recently received 2 new Deutsches Jungvolk uniforms to accommodate his growing limbs, had begun to identify himself as German. After all, as the Führer told him, one day all Europe would belong to Germany anyway, so national identities would no longer matter. "We will be one," he said, "united under a common flag." And with this, he pointed at the swastika armband he wore. That flag. During that visit, the Führer gave Piero one more book from his private library before leaving for Berlin. Piero read that title carefully out loud. "The International Jew," he said, sounding out each syllable carefully. "The World's Foremost Problem," by Henry Ford. "An American, of course," explained Hitler, "but he understands the nature of the Jew, the avarice of the Jew, the manner in which the Jew concerns himself with the accumulation of personal wealth. In my opinion, Mr. Ford should stop making motor cars and run for president. He is a man with whom Germany could work, with whom I could work." Piero took the book and tried not to think about the fact that Ansel was Jewish, but displayed none of the characteristics that the Führer had described. For now, he put it in the drawer of the locker by his bed and returned to Emil and the detectives, which always reminded him of home. A few months later, as the autumn frost began to settle on the mountains and hills of the Obersalzberg, Ernst drove to Salzburg to collect Fräulein Braun, who was coming to the Berghof to prepare for the arrival of some very important guests. Emma was given a list of their favourite dishes, and she shook her head in disbelief. "Well, they're not particular at all, are they?" she said sarcastically. "They're accustomed to certain standards," said Eva, who was already in a flap over the number of arrangements that had to be made. She walked around, clicking her fingers at everyone, and insisting that they work faster. The Führer says that they are to be treated, well, like royalty. I thought our interest in royalty ended with Kaiser Wilhelm, muttered Emma under her breath, before sitting down to compose a list of ingredients she would need to order from the farms around Birch's Garden. I'm glad I'm at school today, Piero told Katrina between classes that morning. Everyone is so busy at home. Herta and Ange. Who's Ange? Asked Katerina, who was given a daily report of events at the Berghof by a friend. The new maid, explained Piero. Another maid? She asked, shaking her head. How many does he need? Piero frowned. He liked Katerina very much, but didn't approve of her occasional mockery of the Führer. She's a replacement, he told her. Fräulein Braun got rid of Wilhelmina. So who does the Führer chase around the Berghof now? The house was at 6s and 7s this morning, he continued, ignoring this comment. He regretted ever having told her the story of Hitler's niece and Emma's theory that the maid reminded him of that unfortunate girl. Every book has been taken off the shelves and dusted, every light fitting removed from its casing and polished, every sheet washed, dried, and pressed until it looks like new once again. Such a lot of drama, said Katerina, for such silly people. The Führer arrived the night before their guests were due and undertook a thorough inspection of the residence, congratulating them all on the work they had done, much to Eva's relief. The next morning, Beatrix called Piero into her room to check that his Deutsches Jungvolk uniform met the master's standards. Perfect, she said, looking him up and down approvingly. You're getting so tall that I was worried it might be too short for you again. There was a knock on the door, and Ange poked her head in. Excuse me, miss, she said, but Piero turned and clicked his fingers sharply at her, just like he'd seen Eva do, and pointed towards the corridor. Get out, he said. My aunt and I are talking. Ange's mouth fell open in surprise, and she stared at him for a moment before stepping back outside and closing the door quietly behind her. There's no need to speak to her like that, Peter, said Aunt Beatrix, who had been equally taken aback by Peter's tone. Why not? He asked. He felt a little surprised that he had acted so authoritatively, but he rather liked the feeling of importance it gave him. We were talking, she interrupted. But it's rude. Piero shook his head, dismissing the idea. She's just a maid, he said, and I am a member of the Deutsches Jungvolk. Look at my uniform. Aunt Beatrix, she must show me the same respect she would any soldier or officer. Beatrix stood up and walked over to the window, staring out towards the mountain tops and the white clouds passing overhead. She placed both hands on the windowsill, as if she were trying to steady herself, in case she let her temper get the better of her. Perhaps you shouldn't spend so much time with the Führer from now on, she said finally, turning round to look at her nephew. But why ever not? He's a very busy man. A busy man who says that he sees great potential in me, said Piero proudly. Besides, we talk about interesting things. He listens to me. I listen to you, Peter, said Beatrix. That's different. Why? You're just a woman, necessary to the Reich, of course, but the business of Germany is best left to men like the Führer and me. Beatrix allowed herself a rather bitter smile. This is something you decided for yourself, is it? No, said Piero, shaking his head hesitantly. It didn't sound quite right to him, that he heard the words spoken out loud. After all, Maman had been a woman, and she'd always known what was best for him. It's what the Führer told me. And you're a man now, are you? She asked, at only 8 years of age. I'll be 9 in a few weeks, he said, standing up to his full height. And you just said yourself I'm getting taller by the day. Beatrix sat down on the bed and patted the quilt, inviting him to sit next to her. What kind of things does the Führer talk to you about? She asked. It's rather complicated, he replied. It has to do with history and politics And the Führer says that the female brain, try me. I'll do my best to keep up. We talk about how we have been robbed, he said. We? Who is this we? You and I? You and him? All of us. The German people. Of course, you're German now, I forgot. My father's birthright is my own, replied Piero defensively. And what have we been robbed of exactly? Our land, our pride. The Jews stole it from us. They're taking over the world, you see. After the Great War. But Peter, she said, you must remember that we lost the Great War. Please don't interrupt me when I'm speaking, Aunt Beatrix, said Piero with a sigh. It shows a lack of respect on your part. Of course I remember that we lost, but you in turn must accept that we suffered indignities afterwards that were designed to humiliate us. The Allies could not be content with victory. They wanted the German people on their knees as retribution. Our country was filled with cowards who gave in to our enemies too easily. We will not make that mistake again. And your father? Asked Beatrix, looking him directly in the eye. Was he one of those cowards? The worst of all, for he allowed weakness to vanquish his spirit. But I'm not like him. I am strong. I will restore pride in the name of Fisher. He stopped and stared at his aunt. What's the matter? He asked. Why are you crying? I'm not crying. But you are. Oh, I don't know, Peter, she said, looking away. I'm just tired, that's all. The preparation has gone into the arrival of our guests has been overwhelming. And sometimes I think... She hesitated, as if apprehensive about finishing the sentence. You think what? That I made a terrible mistake bringing you here. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought that by keeping you close, I could protect you. But as every day goes past... Another knock on the door, and when it opened, Piero spun around angrily. But this time he did not snap his fingers, for it was Fräulein Braun who was standing there. He jumped up off the bed and stood to attention, while Aunt Beatrix remained exactly where she was. They're here, Fräulein Braun said in an excited voice. What do I call them? Whispered Piero, as, filled with excitement and trepidation, he took his place in the receiving line next to his aunt. Your Royal Highness, she said, to both of them, the Duke and the Duchess. But don't say anything at all unless they speak to you first. A few moments later, a car turned the corner at the top of the driveway, and almost simultaneously, the Führer appeared behind Piero, and the staff stood rigidly to attention, eyes facing forward. When Ernst pulled up and turned the ignition off, he jumped out quickly to open the rear door. A small man, wearing a suit that looked a little tight on him, stepped out clutching a hat. He glanced round, his expression one of confusion mixed with disappointment at the lack of fanfare that awaited him. One is generally accustomed to a band of some sort, he mumbled, more to himself than to anyone in particular, before offering a well-practiced Nazi salute, his arm shooting proudly into the air, as if he'd been particularly looking forward to this moment. Herr Hitler, he said in a refined voice, as he switched effortlessly from English to German. So nice to meet you at last. Your Royal Highness, replied the Führer, smiling. Your German is excellent. Yes, well, he muttered, fiddling with his hatband. One's family, you know. He trailed off as if uncertain how to finish this sentence. David, aren't you going to introduce me? Asked a woman who had stepped out of the car behind him. She was dressed entirely in black, as if she were attending a funeral. Her broad American accent could be heard as she switched the conversation back to English. Oh yes, of course. Herr Hitler, may I present Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Windsor. The Duchess pronounced herself charmed, and as did the Führer, who also complimented her on her German. It's not quite as good as the Duke's, she said, smiling, but I get by. Eva stepped forward to be introduced, standing firmly erect as she shook hands, apparently anxious to not be seen to be offering anything even close to a curtsy. The two couples made small talk for a few moments, speaking about the weather, the view from the Berghof, and the drive up the mountain. Times, remarked the Duke. One wouldn't want to have vertigo, would one? Ernst would never have allowed any harm to come to you, replied the Führer, glancing over at the chauffeur. He knows how important you are to us. Asked the Duke, looking up as if he had only just realized that he was in the middle of a conversation. What's that you say? Let's go inside, replied the Führer. You like to take tea at this hour, am I right? A little whiskey, if you have it, said the Duke. The altitude, you know, it takes it out of one. Wallace, are you coming? Yes, David. I was just admiring the house. Isn't it beautiful? My sister and I found it in 1928, said Hitler. We stayed here once on a holiday, and I liked it so much that as soon as I could afford to, I bought it. I come here now wherever I can. It's important for men in our position to have a place of their own, said the Duke, tucking at his shirt cuffs now. Somewhere the world will leave us alone. Men in our position? Asked the Führer, raising an eyebrow. Important men, said the Duke. I had such a place back in England, you know, when I was the Prince of Wales. Fort Belvedere. Wonderful getaway. We threw some extraordinary parties in those days, didn't we, Wallace? I tried to lock myself away there and throw away the key, but somehow the Prime Minister always got in. Perhaps we can find a way for you to return the favour, said the Führer, smiling broadly. Come, let's get you that drink. But who is this little fellow? Asked the Duchess, as she passed Piero. Isn't he dressed beautifully, David? He's like a wonderful little Nazi toy. Oh, I'd like to take him home with me and put him on the mantelpiece. He's so precious. What's your name, Sunshine? Piero looked up at the Führer, who nodded his head. Peter, your Royal Highness, said Piero. The nephew of our housekeeper, explained Hitler. The poor boy was orphaned, so I had agreed that he should come to live here. You see, David, said Wallace, turning to her husband, that's what I call real honest-to-goodness Christian charity. This is what people don't understand about you, Adolf. Now, I can call you Adolf, can't I? And you must call me Wallace. They don't see that underneath all these uniforms and military la-di-da, there lies the heart and soul of a true gentleman. And you, as for you, Ernie, she said, turning to the chauffeur and wagging a gloved finger in his direction, I hope now you see that. Mein Führer, said Beatrix, stepping forward quickly, her voice surprisingly loud as she cut the Duchess off. Would you like me to organise drinks for your guests? Hitler glanced at her in surprise, but amused by what the Duchess had been saying, simply nodded his head. Of course, he said. But inside, I think. It's getting chilly out here. Yes, there was talk of whiskey, wasn't there? Said the Duke, marching in. And as the hosts and staff followed, Piero glanced round and was surprised to see that Ernst was leaning against the car, his face quite pale, paler than he'd ever seen him before. You've gone quite white, said Piero, before mimicking the Duke's accent. The altitude, you know, it takes it out of one, doesn't it, Ernst? Later that evening, Emma handed Piero a tray of pastries and asked him to take them into the study, where the Führer and the Duke were deep in conversation. Ah, Peter, said the Führer as he came in, tapping the table between the two armchairs. You can lay that down here. Can I get you anything else, mein Führer? Your Royal Highness? He asked, but he was so anxious that he addressed each man by the other's title, which made them both laugh. That'd be a thing, wouldn't it? Said the Duke, if I came over here to run Germany. Or if I took over England, replied the Führer. The Duke's smile faded a little at these words, and he fiddled with his wedding ring, pulling it on and off nervously. Do you always have a boy doing these jobs, Herr Hitler? He asked. Don't you have a valet? No, said the Führer. Do I need one? Every gentleman does, or at least a footman in the corner of the room in case you require anything. Hitler considered this and shook his head, as if he could not quite understand the other man's sense of protocol. Peter, he said, pointing towards the corner, stand over there in the corner. You can be an honorary footman during the Duke's visit. Yes, mein Führer, said Piero proudly, moving over to a place beside the door and trying his best to breathe as quietly as possible. You've been awfully good to us, the Duke continued, lighting a cigarette. Everywhere we went, we were treated with such generosity of spirit. We're tremendously pleased. He leaned forward. Wallace is right. I really do think that if the English people could get to know you a little, then they would see what a jolly decent fellow you are. You have a lot in common with us, you know. Is that so? Yes, we share a sense of purpose and a belief in the important destiny of our people. The Führer said nothing, but leaned forward to pour his guest another drink. The way I see it, the Duke said, our two countries have more to gain by working together than apart. Not a formal alliance, of course, more of a sort of entente cordiale, like we have with the French. Although one can never be too trusting when it comes to them. No one wants a repeat of the madness from 20 years ago. Too many innocent young men lost their lives in that conflict, on both sides. Yes, replied the Führer quietly. I fought in it. As did I. You did? Well, not in the trenches, of course. I was heir to the throne then. I had a position. I still have a position, you know. But not the one to which you were born, said the Führer. Although that could change, I suppose, in time. The Duke glanced around as if worried there might be spies hiding behind the curtains. His eyes never once landed on Piero. The boy might have been a statue for all the interest he held in him. You know that the British government didn't want me to come here, right? He said in a confidential tone. And my brother Bertie was in agreement with them. There was an awful fuss. Baldwin, Churchill, all of them rattling their sabres. But why do you listen to them? Asked Hitler. You're no longer king. You're a free man. You can do whatever you choose. I'll never be free, said the Duke mournfully. And anyway, there's the question of resources, if you follow me. One can't simply go out and get a job. But why not? What would you have me do? Work behind the gentleman's counter at Harrods? Open a haberdashery shop? Put myself out as a footman like our young friend over there? He laughed as he pointed towards Piero. All honest jobs, said the Führer quietly, but perhaps beneath your status as a former king. There are perhaps other possibilities. The Duke shook his head, ignoring the question completely, and the Führer smiled. Do you ever regret your decision to abdicate the throne? Not for a moment, replied the Duke, and even Piero could hear the deceit in his voice. Couldn't do it, you see. Not without the help and support of the woman I love. Said as much as my farewell speech, but they were never going to allow her to be queen. And you think that's the only reason they got rid of you? Asked the Führer. Don't you? I think they were frightened of you, he said, just like they're frightened of me. They know how closely connected you felt our country should be. Why, your own great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, was the grandmother of our last Kaiser. And your great-grandfather, Prince Albert, was from Coburg. Your country is as invested in mine as mine is in yours. We're like a pair of great oak trees planted close together. Our roots are intertwined beneath the ground. Cut one down, and the other suffers. Allow one to flourish, and they both will. The Duke considered this for a moment before replying. There may be something in that, he said. You have been robbed of your birthright, continued the Führer, his voice raised now in anger. How can you bear it? Nothing a chap can do, said the Duke. It's all over and done with now. But who knows what the future might hold? What do you mean? Germany is going to change over the years to come. We grow strong once again. We are redefining our place in the world, and perhaps England will change too. You're a forward-thinking man, I believe. I don't think that the Duchess and you could do more good for your people if you were reinstated as king and queen. The Duke bit his lip and frowned. Can't be done, he said after a moment. I had my chance. Anything can be done. Look at me. I'm the leader of a unified German people, and I came from nothing. My father was a shoemaker. My father was a king. My father was a soldier, said Piero from the corner of the room, the words out of his mouth before he could take them back, and the two men turned to look at him as if they'd forgotten he was even present. The Fuhrer threw the boy a look of such fury that he felt his stomach lunge inside and thought he might be sick. All things are possible, continued the Fuhrer after a moment or two, as the men turned back to face each other. If it could be done, would you take back the throne? The Duke looked around anxiously and bit his nails, examining each one in turn before wiping his hand on his trouser leg. Well, of course, one has to consider one's duty, he replied, and what might be best for one's country. In any way, that one would serve. Naturally, one would. He looked up hopefully, like a puppy hoping to be taken into the care of a benevolent master, and the Fuhrer smiled. I think we understand each other, David, he said. You don't mind me calling you David, do you? Well, it's just that no one does, you see, other than Wallace and my family, although they don't call me anything anymore. I never hear from them. I phone Bertie 4 or 5 times a day, but he won't take my calls. The Fuhrer held up his hands. Forgive me, he said. We shall stick with the formalities, Your Royal Highness. He shook his head. Or perhaps one day, once again, Your Majesty. Piero emerged slowly from a dream, feeling as if he had only been asleep for a couple of hours. His half-opened eyes registered the darkness of the room and the sound of breathing. Someone was standing over him, staring down at him as he slept. He opened his eyes completely now to see the Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler, and his heart leaped in fright. He tried to sit up, to salute, but as he did so, he found himself being pushed back down onto the bed. He had never seen the master with such an expression on his face before. It was even more frightening than the one he had seen earlier when he interrupted his conversation with the Duke. Your father was a soldier, was he? Hissed the Duke. Better than mine? Better than the Duke's? You think because he's dead that he was braver than me? No, mein Fuhrer, said Piero breathlessly, the words catching in his throat. His mouth felt terribly dry, and his heart was pounding fiercely in his chest. I can trust you, can't I, Peter? Asked the Fuhrer, leaning over so the bristles of his moustache were almost touching the boy's upper lip. You'll never give me cause to regret allowing you to live here. No, mein Fuhrer, never, I promise it. You better not, he hissed, because disloyalty never goes unpunished. He tapped Piero twice on the cheek before marching out of the room, closing the door behind him. Piero lifted the sheets and looked down at his pajamas. He felt like crying. He had done something he hadn't done since he was a small boy, and he didn't know how he would explain that to anyone. But he swore one thing to himself. He would never let the Fuhrer down again.